November 12, 1942. The shipyards of Richmond, California, buzzed with energy as floodlights illuminated a steel giant resting on its launching rails. Workers in helmets and overalls stood silently, waiting for the moment history would record forever. Before them stood a complete cargo vessel, 441 feet long, weighing nearly 28 million pounds. The SS Robert E. Peary, built not in months, but in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. It was something no shipbuilder had ever imagined possible. For centuries, building a ship of this size required half a year or more. Yet here it was, ready to slide into San Francisco Bay, built by ordinary men and women who, just weeks before, had never seen a shipyard. Former secretaries, farmers, mechanics, housewives, now welders, fitters, and crane operators. The moment was more than a launch. It was a revolution in motion. At the center of it all was one man, Henry Kaiser, a 58-year-old construction magnate who, before the war, had never built a ship in his life. His background was in concrete, roads, and massive dam projects like the Hoover and Grand Coulee. When he first signed a contract in December 1940 to build 30 ships for the British government, experienced shipbuilders laughed. They called him naive, even foolish. But Kaiser didn't think like them. Where they saw tradition, he saw opportunity. Where they saw impossibility, he saw a system waiting to be reimagined. He believed that ships could be built like automobiles, through mass production, standardization, and teamwork. In early 1941, Kaiser's engineers visited Detroit to study how cars were built at the Ford Motor Company. There, they watched in awe as car chassis rolled down assembly lines with precision, each worker performing a single repeated task. One engineer, Clay Bedford, returned to California with a radical idea: ships could be built the same way. Instead of crafting each vessel piece by piece on the dock, what if massive sections were prefabricated separately and then assembled together? Traditional shipwrights dismissed the idea as madness. They said ships were too complex, too large, and too important to build that way. But Kaiser wasn't asking for permission. He was preparing for transformation. The United States Maritime Commission was desperate. German U-boats were sinking Allied cargo ships faster than they could be replaced. In 1941 alone, over 3 million tons of Allied shipping went to the bottom of the ocean. Britain was starving. American shipyards were taking over 200 days to finish a single vessel. The math didn't add up. Something had to change, and Kaiser offered a solution, though an unproven one. His proposal to replace riveting with electric arc welding shocked traditional engineers. Riveting had been the backbone of ship construction for centuries. Crews of riveters would hammer red-hot metal pins into overlapping steel plates, one by one. It was slow, precise, and required years of experience. Kaiser proposed to throw that out entirely and weld the plates together using electricity. To most experts, it sounded dangerous. They claimed welded hulls would crack or fail at sea. But the Maritime Commission had no better options. Out of necessity, not confidence, they gave Kaiser his chance. By the spring of 1941, on the muddy flats of Richmond, California, construction began, not on ships but on the shipyard itself. In less than a year, workers transformed the empty land into one of the largest industrial facilities in America, but it didn't look like any shipyard before it. Instead of long, narrow docks and massive cranes moving slowly over one ship at a time, Kaiser's yard looked like an automobile factory. Wide open spaces for prefabrication surrounded 7 parallel building ways. Railroad tracks ran across the site, carrying giant steel sections from one area to another. Overhead cranes lifted entire parts of ships, sections weighing more than 100 tons, into place like toys. Traditional shipbuilders visiting the site were horrified. They said it violated every rule of proper shipyard design. Yet deep down, they couldn't deny one thing: it was built for speed. Then came the workers, the heart of Kaiser's revolution. They weren't skilled shipwrights. They were ordinary Americans from every corner of the country, drawn by newspaper ads promising good pay and quick training. Women who had never worked outside the home, farmers who had never seen the ocean, young people who had never touched a welder's torch. Kaiser welcomed them all. He broke down the shipbuilding process into hundreds of simple, repeatable tasks. Each worker learned to do one thing and do it perfectly: welding vertical seams, assembling bulkhead panels, fitting decks. It didn't matter if they didn't understand the whole ship. What mattered was that they could perform their single task efficiently and safely. Training that once took years now took just weeks. At first, the process seemed chaotic. The first Liberty ship Kaiser built took 197 days, still faster than traditional yards, but far from revolutionary. But with every ship, workers improved. The second ship took 169 days, the fifth, 128, the 10th, but then by spring 1942, Kaiser's yards were completing ships in just 70 days, less than half the industry average. The results were undeniable. What the experts said couldn't be done was happening again and again. The same untrained men and women the old shipyards had rejected were now producing ships faster than the masters of the craft. The prefabrication system was working. The secret lay in how Kaiser approached the process. Instead of building a ship from the bottom up piece by piece, his teams built sections simultaneously all across the yard. The bow, the stern, the cargo holds, and even the engine rooms were constructed separately, then brought together and welded into place. As one worker put it, while one crew was building the hull, another was already finishing the engine. What once took weeks could now be done in hours. The parallel production system turned shipbuilding into synchronized choreography, a dance of steel, sparks, and precision. To the traditionalists, it looked reckless. To Kaiser, it was the future. He simplified blueprints, cut unnecessary detailing, and encouraged on-the-spot decision-making by workers. He believed perfection was the enemy of speed. As one admiral later said, Kaiser's ships weren't beautiful. They were adequate, and adequate ships delivered cargo, while perfect ones were still being built. By mid-1942, something extraordinary was happening across America's west coast. Workers who had once doubted themselves now took pride in their record-breaking achievements. Yards in California, Oregon, and Washington began competing to see who could build faster. Newspapers reported their times like sports results. A new kind of spirit had taken hold, industrial patriotism. The workers weren't just building ships. They were building the lifeline of Allied victory. And leading them all, with his trademark cigar and restless energy, was Henry Kaiser, the man who had turned impossibility into a production schedule. By the summer of 1942, Henry Kaiser's shipyards had become something of a national miracle. Newspapers across the country were calling him the miracle man of the American home. Front. Reporters came from every corner to see how his workers were turning out massive, ocean-going cargo ships at a pace no one had ever imagined possible for a nation still reeling from Pearl Harbor. These stories became a symbol of American determination, proof that the United States could outproduce the Axis powers and reclaim control of the seas. But Kaiser knew he was only getting started. The demand for ships was increasing faster than ever. German submarines continued to sink Allied vessels in the Atlantic, sometimes more than a dozen in a single week. The British needed food, oil, tanks, and aircraft parts, everything that kept their island nation alive. And now the U.S. military itself was preparing for operations across the Pacific and North Africa. Every one of those missions needed ships, not glamorous battleships or carriers, but cargo ships, strong, fast, and disposable workhorses that could carry supplies wherever they were needed. The Liberty ship became that answer. The Liberty ship was never meant to be beautiful. It was built for one purpose, to move cargo as cheaply and quickly as possible. Its design was based on a British model called the Ocean class, a basic freighter of 10,000 tons. The Maritime Commission had ordered the plans to be simplified even further, making them easy to mass produce. The result was a ship that could carry 9,000 tons of cargo and sail at about 11 knots. It wasn't fast and it wasn't graceful, but it was tough. The men who designed it often joked that the Liberty ship would get you there eventually. Kaiser's genius was not in redesigning the ship, but in rethinking the process behind it. He took the standard Liberty ship blueprint and divided it into roughly 250 prefabricated sections. Each section could be built in a separate location, welded, tested, and then transported to the assembly line. When all the pieces arrived, cranes lifted them into position, and welders sealed the seams together. It was shipbuilding by numbers, a puzzle of steel that came together like clockwork. But such efficiency came with its own set of challenges. Welding was still a new technology in heavy ship construction, and while it was faster than riveting, it required precision. Early Liberty ships faced problems with brittle steel that sometimes cracked in cold waters. Traditional shipbuilders were quick to blame Kaiser's methods, calling his ships tin cans. But the reality was that wartime steel production itself was being rushed. and the metal used wasn't always of consistent quality. When the cracks appeared, Kaiser didn't hide from the problem. He called in engineers and metallurgists to study every failure and redesign joints to distribute stress more evenly. His team learned as they built, improving each ship that followed. Meanwhile, his workers continued to break records. In Portland, Oregon, one of his yards completed a ship in just 10 days. At Richmond, another ship was done in 7 days. The nation was amazed. President Franklin Roosevelt himself visited the shipyards to see what was happening. He watched as sparks flew, cranes swung massive hull sections into place, and men and women in coveralls moved with perfect rhythm. This, Roosevelt said, is democracy at work. What made Kaiser's system so unstoppable was his understanding of people. He knew that machinery and technology could only go so far. It was the human element that truly drove production. His shipyards didn't just train workers. They built communities. He opened schools to teach welding and fabrication. He set up cafeterias that served hot meals, 24 hours a day to match the non-stop production shifts. For mothers with children, he built America's first industrial child care centers right inside the shipyard complex. Nurses, teachers, and caregivers took care of workers' children so that parents could focus on their shifts without worry. For the first time in American history, thousands of women became shipbuilders, welders, and crane operators, jobs once reserved for men. Kaiser was also deeply concerned about the health of his workers. He knew that sick or injured workers slowed down production, so he created a groundbreaking idea: prepaid health plans for all employees and their families. For a small deduction from their wages, workers received full medical care at company-run clinics and hospitals. This system became the foundation for what later evolved into Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare organizations in the United States today. To the outside world, it looked as if Henry Kaiser was performing magic. But inside his shipyards, every achievement was the result of discipline, innovation, and relentless organization. He introduced color-coded charts to track every stage of construction. He demanded that any bottleneck be solved immediately, not next week. Every morning, supervisors reported progress directly to Kaiser's office. He walked through the yards unannounced, speaking directly to workers, asking questions, and listening to their suggestions. If someone on the floor came up with a faster or safer way to perform a task, Kaiser implemented it the same day. By late 1942, production had become almost unbelievable. Ships that once took over half a year were now being completed in less than 2 months, sometimes in under 30 days. And then, in November, came the event that stunned the world: the building of the SS Robert E. Peary in just 4 days and 15 hours. It wasn't a publicity stunt. It was a demonstration of what American industry could achieve when led by vision and urgency. Thousands of workers pushed through day and night, welding, fitting, and assembling without rest. The launch of the ship drew huge crowds, and when it slid into the bay, people cheered as if they were witnessing the launching of a battleship. The Peary wasn't just a record, it was a message. A message to the Axis powers that America's factories and workers could outbuild their submarines. A message to the American people that they were capable of extraordinary things when united by purpose. By the end of 1942, Kaiser's shipyards were producing more Liberty ships than any other in the nation. Richmond alone launched nearly 1 ship every 2 days. At its peak, over 90,000 men and women worked there. An entire city dedicated to shipbuilding. Trains brought in steel from the Midwest. Trucks delivered engines and parts from across the country, and ships left every week carrying tanks, trucks, airplanes, and ammunition to the front lines. Still, Kaiser wasn't satisfied. He believed that if his workers could build ships in days, they could build anything. He began thinking beyond the war, about housing, hospitals, and even automobiles. But for now, the focus was on winning. He once said, "Speed is the greatest weapon in war." And with every new Liberty ship that touched the water, America's chances of victory grew stronger. Behind the headlines, though, the toll was immense. The work was exhausting. Long shifts under the roar of machinery, sparks burning through clothing, and the constant pressure to meet impossible deadlines tested every worker's endurance. Yet morale remained high. They knew that every weld, every plate, every hour of labor was helping soldiers survive overseas. A Liberty ship could carry 7,000 tons of cargo, enough food to feed an army division for weeks or enough ammunition to keep a battle going for days. Every launch was a silent victory against the enemy's blockade. As 1943 began, the Liberty fleet numbered in the hundreds, soon to be thousands. The ships were crude, loud and slow, but they were everywhere. Across the Atlantic, convoys of Liberty ships steamed in long lines, bringing supplies that kept the war effort alive. The simple freighters, once mocked by experts, were now called the ships that won the war. And at the heart of that miracle stood Henry Kaiser, the man who had shown the world that vision, courage, and relentless belief in ordinary people could change the course of history. By early 1943, the name Henry Kaiser had become a legend in American industry. Across the United States, from Washington, D.C. to California, people were talking about the man who had built ships faster than anyone thought possible. Magazines called him the master builder, and newspapers compared his shipyards to beating hearts pumping steel into the arteries of the war effort. But behind the praise, Kaiser knew that his mission was far from over. The war was expanding. New fronts were opening in North Africa, Italy, and the Pacific. The demand for ships, cargo ships, tankers, troop transports was growing beyond imagination. The challenge was no longer just building fast. It was sustaining speed without breaking under pressure. The Richmond shipyards had become a city within a city. Day and night, the sound of welding torches filled the air, a constant crackling thunder of electricity and metal. Sparks rained down like fiery snowflakes. Trains rolled in every hour carrying raw steel from Pittsburgh, engines from Detroit, and prefabricated sections from smaller plants across California. Ships under construction stood side by side like a steel forest, each one in a different stage of assembly. Thousands of workers moved between them, men in heavy gloves, women in bandanas and coveralls, supervisors shouting orders through bullhorns. The scale was breathtaking. In just 2 years, Richmond had grown from a small coastal town into one of the busiest industrial centers in the world. What made it all work was organization. Every task in Kaiser's shipyards was planned like a military operation. Each section of the shipyard was devoted to a specific purpose: fabrication, welding, assembly, painting, testing. Every shift was timed down to the minute. There were charts, graphs, and massive boards that showed the progress of every ship under construction. If a single section fell behind, teams were immediately reassigned to close the gap. It was not just labor. It was choreography. The precision and coordination were unlike anything the shipbuilding industry had ever seen. But the most remarkable part was the workforce itself. By 1943, Kaiser had over 250,000 employees across his shipyards in Richmond, Portland, and Vancouver. They came from all walks of life: farmers from the Midwest, coal miners from Appalachia, housewives from the suburbs, and students barely out of high school. Many of them had never held a torch or hammer before joining. Yet through training, discipline, and teamwork, they became some of the most efficient industrial workers in history. One of the defining symbols of this era was Rosie the Riveter, the image of a woman flexing her arm, with the slogan, "We can do it." In Kaiser's yards, that wasn't just a poster, it was reality. Nearly 1/3 of his workforce were women. They welded, cut steel, and operated cranes, proving that strength and skill weren't limited by gender. Many had husbands, brothers, or sons fighting overseas, and their work felt deeply personal. Every ship they helped launch was another lifeline to their loved ones at war. Kaiser believed in empowering his workers, not controlling them through fear. He often said, "Give people the tools, the training, and the trust, and they'll surprise you every time." He made sure every worker understood the bigger picture, that their job, no matter how small, was part of something monumental. He encouraged innovation from the ground up. If a worker discovered a faster or safer method to do something, Kaiser's managers were required to listen. In one case, a young welder suggested rearranging the order of certain hull plates to save time. Kaiser approved the change immediately, and it shaved hours off every build thereafter. That culture of respect and efficiency turned the yards into living laboratories of industrial progress. Still, the pressure was relentless. America was fighting a global war, and the success of the Allies depended on keeping supply lines open. At sea, German U-boats were still deadly, prowling the Atlantic in wolf packs and sinking ships by the dozen. For every ship destroyed, another had to be built, and fast. In one chilling month, March 1943, more than 100 Allied ships were sunk. Yet by that same summer, American shipyards launched even more. The math had finally turned. The Liberty ships were replacing losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Every launch at Richmond became a celebration. Workers lined the rails, cheering as the massive vessel slid into the water, American flags waving from their bows. Sometimes, the families of workers or fallen soldiers were invited to christen the ships, smashing bottles of champagne against the hull. Each launch carried a name: the John W. Brown, the Jeremiah O'Brien, the Booker T. Washington, names that represented not only great Americans but also the spirit of unity behind the war effort. Many workers said those moments made them feel part of something greater than themselves, something immortal. But there were dark moments too. Welding accidents, machinery failures, and fatigue were constant dangers. Some workers fell ill from exhaustion or heat. Kaiser refused to ignore these realities. He expanded his medical programs, increased rest breaks, and introduced safety committees run by workers themselves. These ideas were ahead of their time, but they worked. Productivity rose, accidents fell, and morale stayed high. The shipyards were proof that caring for workers wasn't just good ethics, it was good business. The Liberty ships themselves were proving their worth on the high seas. Though slow and noisy, they were tough and dependable. They carried ammunition to Africa, tanks to Europe, food to Britain, and even locomotives to Russia under the Lend-Lease program. Sailors called them ugly ducklings, but they quickly learned to respect them. Some ships survived torpedo hits and kept sailing. Others made dangerous Arctic runs to supply the Soviet front, facing ice, storms, and enemy aircraft. The cargo they carried meant survival for millions. By the end of 1943, Kaiser's yards alone had built more than 300 Liberty ships. The U.S. as a whole had built over 1,000. The scale of production was staggering. One ship launched every 8 hours. Somewhere in America, the nation's industrial power was now unmatched. And much of that credit went to Henry Kaiser's vision of mass production. He had proven that innovation, organization, and belief in ordinary people could achieve miracles. Still, Kaiser's ambitions didn't stop at Liberty ships. He saw the next phase of industrial warfare coming: faster ships, better engines, more efficient tankers. He began developing new designs, including the Victory ships, which were larger and faster successors to the Liberty class. These ships could carry more cargo and move at higher speeds, reducing their vulnerability to submarines. The Maritime Commission was impressed. Kaiser was not just keeping up with the war, he was staying ahead of it. Yet even as his shipyards reached peak production, Kaiser began thinking about what would happen when the war ended. He knew that when peace returned, millions of workers would lose their wartime jobs. Entire shipyards might fall silent, but he believed America's new industrial knowledge should not disappear. He dreamed of turning the same efficiency that built ships into building homes, hospitals, and cars for a better post-war world. "We can't just stop building," he said. "We must build for peace as we have built for war." For now, though, the war still raged. Each day brought new orders, new deadlines, new ships to launch. The Liberty fleet was becoming an unstoppable tide, stretching across the Atlantic and Pacific, carrying the tools of victory. Henry Kaiser had transformed America's shipbuilding industry into a war-winning machine. But what he didn't yet realize was that his greatest legacy would not just be ships. It would be the system, the spirit, and the belief that ordinary people could achieve the extraordinary. By 1944, the roar of Kaiser's shipyards had become the rhythm of America's war machine. The sparks of welding torches lit up the California nights like constellations of fire. From Richmond to Portland, ships rose from steel plates and blueprints faster than anyone could count. Every launch added another vessel to the swelling fleet that now stretched across the oceans. Liberty ships were no longer just cargo carriers. They were lifelines, symbols of hope and engines of victory. Henry J. Kaiser had done the impossible. In less than 3 years, he had turned an unskilled workforce into the most efficient shipbuilding force the world had ever seen. The Liberty ships were everywhere. They carried tanks, trucks, bombs, food, and oil across treacherous seas. They supplied troops in Normandy, brought relief to starving civilians in Europe, and carried war materials to the Pacific Islands. The U.S. Army and Navy relied on them completely. A single Liberty ship could carry enough fuel to keep hundreds of aircraft in the sky or enough food to feed tens of thousands of soldiers. Without them, the war could not have been sustained. Allied commanders knew it. Winston Churchill himself admitted that the Battle of the Atlantic, the longest and most brutal struggle of the war, was won not by new weapons, but by America's shipbuilders and their relentless production of Liberty ships. Inside the shipyards, morale reached its peak. Workers felt like soldiers in their own right, fighting a different kind of battle, one of time, steel, and endurance. Each new record brought celebration and pride. When the 1,000th Liberty ship rolled off the ways, workers cheered, cried, and waved American flags. The nation understood that the war was being won as much in the factories as on the front lines. Henry Kaiser became the face of that victory, a living symbol of what the United States could accomplish when imagination met determination. But even as the victories mounted, new challenges emerged. The war was changing, and so were the demands of logistics. Liberty ships, though sturdy, were slow. The Maritime Commission wanted something faster, more advanced. Kaiser's engineers began work on the next generation, the Victory ships. They were longer, sleeker, and could travel at 17 knots, 6 knots faster than the Liberty class. They also had stronger hulls, better engines, and more efficient designs. Once again, Kaiser's yards adapted with astonishing speed, retooling entire facilities to meet new specifications. As the Victory ships took shape, it became clear that Kaiser's approach wasn't just about shipbuilding, it was about a philosophy of production. His system of prefabrication, assembly line workflow, and worker empowerment had rewritten the rules of modern manufacturing. Other industries began studying his methods. Automobile companies, aircraft manufacturers, and even construction firms sent engineers to observe his processes. What they learned would influence industrial production for decades to come. Meanwhile, Kaiser was already thinking beyond the war. He saw an America that would soon need homes for returning soldiers, hospitals for growing families, and affordable transportation for everyone. He began forming plans for peacetime, industries that could carry over the spirit of wartime innovation. His health plan for workers expanded, eventually becoming the foundation of Kaiser Permanente, providing health care to millions long after the last ship was launched. He also entered steel production, believing America should not depend on foreign imports for its raw materials. And he wasn't done yet. He dreamed of building a car affordable for every American family, designed and built with the same efficiency that had produced his ships. But in 1945, before peace could be fully celebrated, tragedy and triumph came hand in hand. The war in Europe ended in May, followed by victory in the Pacific a few months later. The world erupted in celebration, and the shipyards fell silent for the first time in years. Workers stood together, exhausted but proud, watching the final ships leave the docks. In total, Henry Kaiser's shipyards had produced 490 Liberty ships, hundreds of Victory ships, tankers, troop carriers, and repair vessels. Combined, his yards built over 500 major ships, nearly a quarter of all merchant ships produced by the United States during the war. It was a record that would never be broken again. When the war ended, many expected Kaiser to fade into history, another industrial hero whose name would be remembered only in textbooks. But he refused to stop. He turned his attention to the next challenge, building for peace. He began constructing homes for returning veterans and their families, using prefabricated methods similar to those in his shipyards. He expanded his healthcare system and opened new hospitals. In 1945, he founded Kaiser Frazer Motors, teaming up with Joseph Frazer to enter the automobile industry. His cars, including the Henry J, were affordable, durable, and designed for the working class. Though his car company would eventually close, the ideas behind it, efficiency, accessibility, and innovation, paved the way for the post-war boom that transformed American life. Kaiser's influence also extended to infrastructure and education. He funded schools, research centers, and community programs. He believed that progress was a shared responsibility, that industry should serve society, not just profit from it. His legacy was more than ships and steel. It was a vision of how technology and humanity could work together for a better world. The Liberty ships themselves continued to serve long after the war. Some were converted into hospital ships, others into training vessels, and many continued to transport goods well into the 1950s and 1960s. A few still survive today as museum ships, floating monuments to the workers who built them and the man who made it all possible. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien and the SS John W. Brown remain preserved, their decks echoing with the memory of hammers, torches, and laughter from another era. Looking back, the story of Henry J. Kaiser was never just about shipbuilding. It was about the transformation of ordinary people into extraordinary creators. It was about the belief that no challenge is too great when faced with courage, innovation, and unity. His work changed the course of World War II, but it also changed the very idea of what industry could achieve. In the end, historians would call Kaiser's Liberty ships the ships that won the war, but perhaps their greatest victory was not on the ocean. It was in proving what human determination could accomplish under pressure. From a man who had never built a ship before the age of 60 came one of the most astonishing achievements in modern history. As one of his foremen once said, "We didn't just build ships, we built victory, one weld at a time." Today, whenever a Liberty ship is seen gliding in a museum harbor, its rusted steel and weathered decks whisper the same story, the story of how a nation united under one vision, led by one relentless dreamer, and changed the world with fire, steel, and unbreakable will. And at the center of it all stands the name Henry J. Kaiser, a man who proved that with imagination, organization, and the courage to defy tradition, you can build not just ships, but history itself.